Welcome to this session of the Friday lectures at Peking University. Today we're very honored and excited to have Dr. George Hull of Cape Town University speaking to us. And so George Hull studied at Cambridge, Tübingen, London, and Frankfurt, and received his PhD from University College London. He's currently a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Cape Town, and his main focus is social and political philosophy. But he's also written on philosophy of action, and epistemology. One of his latest papers is an excellent paper in Synthese, I think one of the best journals in philosophy, about epistemic redress. So in very interesting ways, he combines social and political philosophy with theoretical philosophy, and is on the very cutting edge of contemporary concerns about both epistemology, social political philosophy, and ethics. He edited one of the most important collections about egalitarianism in the last few years, entitled The Equal Society, with Lexington Books, that came out in 2015 and received really great reviews, including one in Philosophical Quarterly. But another area of specialism at which he's at the very cutting edge is, since he's been at Cape Town, he's also worked on comparative philosophy, especially African philosophy. So one of the things he's done is created a debate and a platform for social and political ideas and ethical ideas and theoretical philosophical ideas in not just the Western world, to be able to be discussed and debated. And this came together in 2019 in a brilliant, really excellent collection with Routledge called Debating African Philosophy, which also received very glowing reviews from the best places. There are many discussions in debating African philosophy, for instance, about African philosophy of language, and I think there might be a paper on quite a few papers also on African political and social philosophy, including discussions and contributions from people who were at the forefront of some of the sort of interesting movements in South African history. George Hull has also, as I've mentioned, published in some of the best journals in philosophy, especially in social and political philosophy, but also in generalist journals. So in the Journal of Applied Philosophy, Journal of Global Ethics, Philosophia, Philosophical Papers, and Synthese. He's just one of the most interesting and groundbreaking philosophers around at the moment. I've had many interesting conversations with him over the years, and we're just extremely delighted to have George Hull speak, Dr. Hull speak with us and to us about a topic which is very close to all of our hearts, and is a topic that quite a lot of you will know about. And so the title of his talk is Alienation, the Diagnosis of Vicarious Flourishing. I mean, he'll tell us what he'll say, but I think we're all very excited to hear him speak about this topic. I guess without further ado, I think I should let George Hull take the stage after I say this. So George, Dr. Hull will speak for about an hour, as is customary with the Friday lectures. And then after that, I'll be chairing the 1 hour Q&A session. So I'll give us more information about how that's going to be arranged for the people who are new here. But let's all welcome Dr. Hull. Yes. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schiffer. Thank you very much, Arthur. And thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be able to speak to you in the Peking University Institute of Foreign Philosophy Friday lecture series. Thank you to Dean Han Schweifer, Vice Dean Liu Zhe, and the chair, Arthur Schiffer. I hope he hasn't raised your expectations too much, but thank you to everybody who's taking the time to attend this talk. I'm now going to share my screen, and just let me know if there's any problem with the visuals or the audio. Okay, I think that's worked. So in this presentation, I want to outline and argue for an interpretation of what a small group of innovative social critics in Germany, there wasn't a Germany at that time, but they were German speakers in the 1840s, what they meant by alienation. So these were the young Hegelians who were influenced by G.W.F. Hegel, the German philosopher, but they rejected his metaphysical idealism, and they used ideas and concepts from Hegel in a very different way from Hegel himself. Now that's pretty much all I'm going to say about Hegel. I'm going to focus on the works of Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx from the first half of the 1840s, not their later works. Another young Hegelian theorist that one might look at for the concept of alienation is Bruno Bauer, but I will focus on Feuerbach and Marx in this talk. Now, the publication of Feuerbach's book, The Essence of Christianity, in 1841, unleashed a surge of intellectual activity among this tightly knit group of young German thinkers. And that lasted really until the outbreak of the Europe-wide revolutions in 1848. The unifying point of reference of the young Hegelians, or they're also called the left Hegelians sometimes, was this Feuerbachian critique of Christianity. As Friedrich Engels wrote at the time, we all became at once Feuerbachians. Now, the most famous text by a philosopher on alienation is, I think, almost certainly Engels' friend and collaborator Karl Marx's 1844 manuscripts, also called the Economic Political Manuscripts, the section of that entitled Estranged Labour or Alienated Labour. One thing I'm going to argue is that in order really to understand what Marx is proposing in this text about alienation, but also in order to understand what he's proposing in another text from the same period called On the Jewish Question, we've got to register just how much of a Feuerbachian, as Engels says, he was. I think other interpreters have not seen this, or sometimes they've not registered exactly what work the phenomenon of alienation was doing in Feuerbach's book. And so what analogy Marx is drawing when he explicitly draws comparisons between the Feuerbachian critique of religion and his critiques, Marx's critiques of political and economic phenomena of the time. But apart from defending an interpretation of the young Hegelian conception of alienation, I also want to argue, albeit briefly, that the concept of alienation which I'm going to recover from them, from Feuerbach and Marx, is of relevance and potentially of great use for contemporary political philosophy and contemporary empirical social criticism in a particular way, which I think has not yet quite been appreciated, even though, of course, there is a lot of writing about alienation in one sense or another. I'm going to argue that alienation, this concept of alienation, can be a useful concept of social criticism, specifically within the framework of liberal political theory or political philosophy. Now, that might seem a strange contention, a difficult thesis to support, given that in his essay on the Jewish question, Marx famously employs the concept of alienation precisely to criticize liberal politics based on rights. Nonetheless, liberal political philosophy, particularly in the tradition going from John Stuart Mill to John Rawls more recently and to the present day, is partly marked out by its acceptance of the doctrine of pluralism. Pluralism specifically about conceptions of the good or ethical outlooks. So this is pluralism about ethical outlooks, pluralism about legitimate ways of trying to live a flourishing life, saying that there's more than one of those, and in fact, many and very different ways of living a good human life. In liberal political philosophy, sometimes pluralism about conceptions of the good is metaphysical. That's the view of Joseph Raz in the middle, who recently passed away. You know, the idea that there just is, as a metaphysical matter of fact, a plurality of ways of living a good life. It may also be epistemic, the view that given the human condition, reasonable people may come to a plurality of incompatible conclusions, whether they're right or not, about what overall human well-being consists in. And that's the view which is associated with John Rawls. So liberal theorists of justice who accept pluralism generally try to remain neutral or impartial in their theory, in their recommendation for political order, between a very large, even an indefinite number of versions of human well-being or the human good life, ways of flourishing as a human being. Sometimes they don't extend this impartiality to conceptions of well-being which are directly unjust. For example, if they recommend the oppression of others as an end in itself, or they restrict it to conceptions of well-being which pass a relatively undemanding test of reasonableness. That being said, the liberal egalitarian consensus, I think, is that even when unreasonable and directly unjust conceptions of human well-being have been ruled out of consideration, many and various conceptions of human well-being or ethical outlooks which need to be accommodated in a sort of multicultural liberalism remain. So this raises a couple of questions. First of all, how does one legitimate a political order based on coercion in a way which is equally acceptable to the plurality of conceptions of the human good? It also raises another question which I am interested in and I want to explore using this concept of alienation, which is, and this is a question which I don't think that liberal political philosophy can altogether bypass. And that is the question, are there rational ways of criticizing a conception of the good, a substantial ethical outlook, which don't involve simply imposing or presupposing the particular ethical outlook or conception of the good which you adhere to as the critic? So can we give rational grounds for criticizing a substantial conception of the human good or ethical outlook without simply foisting, imposing our own conception of the good on other people? Can we remain neutral between conceptions of the good while conducting that kind of social critique? Well, that seems like a big ask, but an obvious way in which this is done, I would suggest, is when we point to contradictions within somebody's viewpoint. So one person voices a number of views, then we point out, well, you can't think Y as well as X because X entails not Y. So you've just contradicted yourself. Now you're not imposing your conception of the good or your beliefs about anything, you're just pointing out an inconsistency in somebody's viewpoint. Now that's what is sometimes called immanent or internal critique. giving people reasons to change their thinking and their behavior based on what they already think or what they already do. But there's only so far that one can go with the exposure of contradictions. You might think that sometimes outlooks need to be criticized even when they don't contain flagrant contradictions. What I'm going to suggest is that the critique of alienation, as we can recover it from the young Hegelians, is a more sophisticated form of internal critique of a substantial ethical outlook, potentially, than just finding contradictions. In developing the critique of alienation as a form of internal or immanent critique of ethical outlooks, I believe that what I'm doing is more or less in line with an aspiration of the young Hegelians, but one which was perhaps not really brought to fruition in the work of Feuerbach and Marx. So, for example, Marx, in a public letter to Arnold Ruger from 1843, wrote, "Like Feuerbach's critique of religion, our whole aim can only be to translate religious and political problems into their self-conscious human form." Very typical of Marx in this period to begin his sentences by saying, like in Feuerbach's critique of religion. Now, this cryptic statement gets unpacked a little bit in what he says next. Our program must be the reform of consciousness, not through dogmas. So I take that to mean not through simply imposing as a dogma one's own ethical outlook, one's own conception of the good on the people one's criticizing. Not through dogmas, but by analyzing mystical consciousness obscure to itself, whether it appear in religious or political form. It will then become plain that the world has long since dreamed of something of which it needs only to become conscious for it to possess it in reality. Now, I don't pretend this is totally perspicuous on its face, but I do think that he's pointing to a type of internal or immanent critique here, and one which goes further than just finding contradictions in people's worldview. And as I will try to outline, I do believe that this is what Marx was trying to do with his critique using the concept of alienation. And that's why it's so relevant to a liberal multicultural form of social criticism today. Okay, so the position I want to defend, this is sort of where we're heading, is this. There is alienation when a set of individuals or an individual realizes or approximates a conception of the human good or a putative conception of the human good. But they do so, as I'm putting it in the title of this talk, vicariously, rather than realizing or approximating a conception of the human good in their own lives through what they themselves do and achieve. They participate in ensuring that it's realized or that it's approximated, this conception of the good, in some non-human entity. And that can include sort of institutions or systems which are composed of humans, but they're not a human being themselves. And that could be an imagined entity, or it could be a real entity, that's the top of the screen there, with the consequence that their own prospects for flourishing in the relevant way, according to that conception of the human good, are significantly impaired. So that's the general structure I have in mind, and I hope it will become a lot clearer as I flesh it out with particular cases. I should say this is work in progress, and one thing that I'm not totally happy with is the word vicarious in the title, because this could suggest that I'm saying that people subject to alienation do manage to flourish or realize their conception of the good. It's just that they do it via or through someone else. But that's not really the idea. Rather, it's precisely through displacing the realization of a conception of the good onto something else, which is not me, that I make it impossible for me to realize that conception of the good. In any case, so alienation, as on my interpretation, that's understood by the young Hegelians, is always going to include three components. First of all, there will be a form or a putative form, something which people believe is a form of human flourishing, an ethical outlook, a conception of the good which could be realized. That's going to be displaced or projected onto something which approximates a realized form of that form of flourishing. Second, there's going to be what I'll call a vehicle of displaced or vicarious substitute flourishing, that onto which the realized version of the human good is projected or displaced. And thirdly, there are the deleterious, harmful effects of this displacement, specifically the fact that this displacement means that those who do it can't actually realize that conception of the good, that form of human flourishing in their own lives. Now, when I chose the word vicarious, I was really thinking actually of the way that sometimes people criticize parents for trying to live out the life that they wish that they'd lived, but vicariously via their children. Of course, when we do that, just as with my interpretation of alienation, we're not saying that they actually manage to flourish themselves by pressuring their children to make certain choices. On the contrary, we're implying that they're setting themselves up for failure and also putting their children in a difficult position when parents try to live out their own aspirations through their children. In general, I think the point is that there are some things which people can do for you, perhaps your political representatives or other representatives, things that we can do through other people, but to live a good human life, to succeed at flourishing as a human being is not one of them. That can't be delegated to somebody else. So an attempt, whether conscious or not, to flourish vicariously is doomed to failure. All right, let me move on to my first philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach, and his critique of Christianity. So this is the interpretative part of the talk. So Feuerbach, often, interpreters get very awkward or embarrassed about Feuerbach's talk about the human species essence, or the human essence in his critique of Christianity. But I think it's important to see that it's actually something quite familiar to contemporary political and moral theory. So Feuerbach begins his critique of Christianity with a discussion of the essential nature of the human being. What is the nature of man? What constitutes the specific distinction, the proper humanity of man? He intends his answer to this question to serve not only as an accurate description of the human species, but also as an evaluative standard by which individual species members, individual humans, are to be measured, are to be evaluated. Thus, the distinguishing marks of the human species equally count for individual humans as our purpose or end, the goal of an individual human life. Often, of course, individual humans don't live up to this standard of essential human nature. And that's a deficiency or a limitation on their part, on that individual's part, according to Feuerbach. And Feuerbach says that awareness of that kind of deficiency ought to shame us, though often we pretend that our individual limitations are limitations of human nature. Now, by the way, I'm not, in interpreting Feuerbach and in interpreting Marx, I'm not necessarily endorsing any of their particular critiques of alienation or any of their particular claims about human flourishing and their conception of the good. All I want to do is recover the structure of their critique using the concept of alienation. So I will talk about what they think are cases of alienation and what they think the human good consists of, but I'm not endorsing that. I'm just trying to work out the structure of the alienation critique. Now, so far, I think Feuerbach's undertaking is quite a familiar one, certainly not unique to him or to philosophers with a Hegelian background. Up to the present day, theorists in the Aristotelian tradition in moral and political philosophy have argued that a full and accurate description of what a non-defecting, flourishing specimen of a human being, they've argued that a full and accurate description of what it is to be a human being must include a conception of what a non-defective or flourishing specimen would be. So many Aristotelian theorists, Philippa Foot, for example, Rosalind Hursthouse, conceive of the moral virtues either as constituent parts of or as optimal means to the end or ends internal to the human life form. Likewise, in political philosophy, Martha Nussbaum has endeavored to derive a set of minimum capabilities to which she claims citizens are entitled from a description of characteristically human well-being. So what is the content of Feuerbach's concept of essential human nature? Well, it is succinct, though not perhaps altogether determinate: reason, will, affection, or willing, feeling, and thinking. That's how he puts it. These are, from a descriptive point of view, the essential characteristics of the species, and from an evaluative point of view, they are excellences to which individual humans must aspire. Feuerbach expresses the evaluative and indeed the teleological side of the species characteristics when he writes, "Man exists to think, to love, to will." So unlike contemporary Aristotelian theorists, Feuerbach doesn't attempt to locate levels of achievement along his dimensions of essential humanity which constitute virtue, or levels of capability which constitute adequate welfare. Instead, what he emphasizes is that while individual humans are limited in the degree to which and manner in which they realize reason, affection, and will, these species characteristics are potentially infinite. And I think the idea here is that it can provide some ethical orientation because it entails that however much or however well we think, use our reason, or love, use our sort of social capacities, and will translate our plans into action, we could always do so more or better. And that's what, as human beings, we should be trying to do. That's Feuerbach's conception of human flourishing. So Feuerbach's reliance on a conception of essential human nature, which he takes to have normative implications, is not at all unfamiliar. It doesn't set him apart from many contemporary moral and political philosophers. What is different and what is distinctive is what he does with this normative conception of human nature. With this yardstick or standard for human flourishing, the human good in hand, you might expect Feuerbach's next move to proceed by measuring Christians' behavior. After all, he's critiquing Christianity against this yardstick of his conception of human nature. Or you might think that he would now begin to assess the extent to which Christian doctrine coincides with his own account of the human good. But that's not how Feuerbach proceeds. He doesn't simply use his conception of human nature as a yardstick by which to criticize Christians or Christianity. He proceeds in a much more indirect way. And that's because I think that's because he envisages the critique of alienation as most effective when it is a form of internal or immanent critique of a worldview. So in the essence of Christianity, Feuerbach argues that believing Christians are subject to an illusion. The illusion in question is multifaceted. It involves, first of all, Christians attributing what is in fact their own essential nature as human beings to an imaginary non-human being. He writes, "It is our task to show that the antithesis of divine and human is altogether illusory, that it is nothing else than the antithesis between human nature in general and the human individual." Christian belief, conceived of as consciousness of God, is in a sense to be equated with the self-consciousness of man, says Feuerbach. Though not directly aware of this identity, the religious man is setting this up. And in fact, Feuerbach says, ignorance of this identity is fundamental to the peculiar nature of religion, Christianity in particular. Now, the second aspect of the illusion is to which Feuerbach claims that believing Christians are subject can be described as a category error. We've seen that Feuerbach is at pains to distinguish between the particular characteristics of individual species members and the essential characteristics of a species. When Christians project the essential human species characteristics onto God, claims Feuerbach, they do not respect this distinction. Rather, reason, affection, and will are attributed to God in the guise of infinite accomplishments of an individual being. So God is given the characteristics of infinite providence, omnibenevolence, omniscience, and omnipotence. In other words, the God of the Christians is essential human nature conceived of as a personal being. That's why I say it's a category mistake. But misapprehending the human species essence as a non-human individual person, which is what Feuerbach claims they're up to, leads Christians, thirdly, to misapprehend the nature of the normative or ethical requirements which apply to them. As we've seen, Feuerbach believes that human beings should raise themselves above the limits of their individuality, and as they do so, the laws, the positive essential conditions of his species should serve as a guide to an individual. However, owing to the first and the second aspect of the Christian illusion, which I've just outlined, Feuerbach thinks that Christians misapprehend the ends internal to their own human nature as commandments issued by a non-human individual, God. So in other words, he thinks that the normative requirements of our essence as human beings are misapprehended as instructions which are being given to us by a person. It's this third aspect which leads Feuerbach in the concluding chapter of his book to characterize the Christian religion as an illusion which is by no means indifferent, but which on the contrary is profoundly injurious or harmful, because it deprives humans of the power of real life and of the genuine sense of truth and virtue. He particularly stresses the Christian illusion's negative effects on the social aspects of human nature, affection, in Feuerbach's shorthand, though we could perhaps call it sociality, to distinguish it from just the feeling of an emotion. He's talking about sort of human capacities and activities. So Christians, of course, believe that God commands them to love one another. But as Feuerbach points out, loving somebody out of obedience to a third party risks ceasing to be love at all. Love in the deepest, truest emotional sense becomes, by means of religiousness, merely ostensible or illusory, since religious love gives itself to man only for God's sake, so that it is given only in appearance to man, but in reality to God. So the idea there is that if you love somebody or you behave lovingly towards somebody because God has instructed you to, it's not really love. What you're using love or loving behavior as a means to obedience towards God. So as Feuerbach puts it, religion is jealous of morality. It sucks away the best forces of morality. The Christian illusion for Feuerbach also has a negative effect on people's exercise of their productive capacities, will, or as we might put it, productivity. It encourages people, rather than developing and manifesting their own ability to bring about positive effects in the world, to focus on soliciting interventions from an all-powerful deity through prayer and worship. So in general, all those dispositions which ought to be devoted to life, to man, to actually achieving things, putting one's will into action, are lavished on the being who wants nothing, and that's God. Similarly, he thinks that believing Christians' exercise of their reason is impaired by the Christian illusion. Rather than actively seeking truth, Christianity can encourage believers passively to wait for revelation or to redirect their intellectual energies towards attempts at decoding revelations in sacred texts. Okay, so according to Feuerbach, Christians have attributed the essential species character of humanity, so that's the conception of the good, potentially unlimited reason, rationality, feeling or sociality, and will or productivity, to a fictional, non-human being. So that's the diamond at the top, an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent deity, with the result that, with the consequence that their own flourishing by that same standard, by the standard of what Feuerbach takes to be essential human nature, is adversely affected. So that's the same schema that I started with, and I'm showing how Feuerbach's critique of Christianity fits into it. It's sometimes said that Feuerbach's critique of Christianity is too bound up with a Hegelian pattern of thought, which says that there's a kind of developmental process of human consciousness, of externalization, recognition, and reconciliation. And it's certainly true that Feuerbach sees religions as going through a series of stages. But this teleological narrative is actually detachable from Feuerbach's conception of the alienation phenomenon itself, the illusion in the case of Christianity. Feuerbach's critique of Christianity as an illusion with deleterious consequences for humans flourishing, according to their own essential nature, is self-standing, and it can be applied, I think, without reference to any teleological conception of history. Okay, so that's Feuerbach. Now let me move on to Marx. I'm going to be stressing the continuity between Marx's conception of alienation, his use of it as a conceptual tool for social criticism, and that of Feuerbach. Nonetheless, Marx's use of the concept involves innovations, some differences from Feuerbach. Marx makes three significant innovations with the concept in his writings from the first half of the 1840s. First of all, he shows that the concept of alienation can be applied outside the religious sphere. The first task of philosophy, he writes, once the holy form of human self-alienation has been discovered, and of course that was Feuerbach's discovery, is to discover self-alienation in its unholy forms, i.e. in other spheres. Second, Marx shows that the vehicle, as I've been calling it, or what Marx, using the language of seances, likes to call the medium, or the intermediary, the vehicle of a distinctive kind of human flourishing need not be an imaginary one. So in the case of Feuerbach's critique of religion, of course, that onto which human flourishing is projected is what he takes to be a fictional being. But humans, Marx will propose, could create something which somewhat approximates a realized instantiation of essential human nature, and which frustrates their own flourishing, not in dream or fantasy, as in the case of Christianity, but, and this is a quote, in present and material reality. Third, Marx suggests that several different forms of human alienation, self-alienation, can exist in a society simultaneously and be causally interconnected. So in particular, he thinks that religious alienation is caused by alienation in the economic sphere. All right, well, though innovating with the concepts, in his writings from this period, Marx remains true to Feuerbach's core ideas. So now to the continuity. He embraces the theoretical presupposition that humanity has an essential nature, which functions as an ideal to which individual humans should aspire. He, in writings from this period, for example, his comments on James Mill, he talks about realizing one's own essence, contrasts man in his contingent existence with man as a true species being, and uses that conceptual framework. So like Feuerbach, Marx regards the human essence as a descriptive attribute of humanity as a species, and yet at the same time as an evaluative standard, which most, perhaps all existing humans don't yet live up to. What is also indubitable is that Marx agrees with Feuerbach's diagnosis of religion in general and Christianity in particular, as cases of alienation. In an article for the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, Marx describes religion as the fantastic realization of the human essence, in a situation where the human essence has not acquired any true reality. So that's the Feuerbachian critique of Christianity as a form of alienation. As for other young Hegelians at this time, Feuerbach's critique of religion was, for Marx, a fixed point by which to triangulate. And since his writings from this time are actually often notes for his own eyes or addressed principally to fellow Feuerbachians, he doesn't spell this out. He frequently refers elusively to central ideas from the essence of Christianity in order to orientate his reader. And as I've said, his innovations with the concept of alienation are often introduced with a clause setting up an analogy explicitly with, between his new claim and the familiar Feuerbachian one. So let me move now to the most famous discussion of alienation in his economic and philosophical manuscripts. If, as Marx's frequent allusions and comparisons suggest, alienated labor is to be understood as conforming to the same schema as religious alienation, three questions need to be answered. In Marx's famous early text, what form or putative form of human flourishing is alienated? What is the vehicle, or as Marx likes to say, the medium of vicarious flourishing? Onto what is this conception of the human good displaced or projected? And thirdly, how does this prevent humans themselves from flourishing? What are the deleterious consequences of this displacement? The first question in Marx's text, the economic and philosophical manuscript, is the easiest to answer. For humans, Marx writes, productive life is species life. Well, humans are distinguished from other species, says Marx, by the fact that they can apply their rationality in production. Consciousness and humans' intellectual species powers, as Marx puts it, mean that humanity as a species produces in a qualitatively different way from other animal species, according to Marx. Animals produce only according to the standards and needs of the species to which they belong. Man is capable of producing according to the standards of every species, of applying to each object its inherent standard. Man also produces in accordance with the laws of beauty. So this is pointing out that humans in their productive activity, so in the use of their will, as Feuerbach would put it, they also exercise their rationality, their reason. They plan, they envisage what they're going to do, and then they carry it out. As we saw earlier, perhaps I didn't quote that yet. In his notes on James Mill, Marx writes that in a situation where humans produce as human beings, in your use of, or enjoyment of my products, so if I produce something and you use it or enjoy it, I would have the immediate satisfaction and knowledge that in my labor, I had gratified a human need. So there's every reason to think that Marx thinks that human labor or human productivity needs to include a manifestation of sociality, what Feuerbach is calling affection or heart. So it's quite reasonable to conclude, I think, that all three of Feuerbach's aspects of human essential nature are present in the conception of the human essence, which the early Marx is operating with. Although he emphasizes productivity much more than Feuerbach, of course, because that's his interest, Marx emphasizes that truly human productivity would instantiate sociality and rationality also. So here's one respect in which I think Marx is much more of a Feuerbachian at this stage in his career than a lot of commentators note. Not only is he using the concept of alienation to diagnose the problem he's interested and operating with the idea of a human essence or species being, which is both descriptive and normative, but the content of the normative human essence or species being that he's working with is more or less the same as that of Feuerbach: rationality, sociality, productivity, or reason, will, and affection. As I say, a difference of emphasis, Feuerbach tends to highlight sociality and love between humans, whereas for Marx, it's productivity, which is the focus, but productivity in a way which manifests rationality and sociality. All right, the second question, what the vehicle of alienation, of vicarious flourishing is in economic alienation, is, I believe, best approached by the third question, that of how economic alienation has a deleterious effect on individuals' flourishing. In the answer to this third question, retrievable from Marx's text, there's a striking parallel with Feuerbach's conception of religious alienation. So as we know from earlier, that's a slide from earlier, Feuerbach is of the view that believing Christians end up taking part in friendship and loving relations, not as ends in themselves, i.e. as constituent parts of true human flourishing, but in order to be obedient to God's commandments, they become a means to an end. Similarly, Marx claims that in the economic sphere of civil society, work as characteristic human activities are rendered instrumental. In economic alienation, writes Marx, life activity, productive life itself, appears to man only as a means for the satisfaction of a need. the need to preserve physical existence. So that's when workers take part in productive activity because otherwise they're going to starve. They're not going to be able to sustain themselves. For capitalists, on the other hand, those who own the means of production, the incentive of making more profits is, in Marx's view, determinative. So in this case, characteristic human activity is instrumentalized not for the sake of obedience to a supernatural being, but instrumentalized due to the incentive system which the institutions of capitalism operating together generate. So in other words, whereas in religious alienation, the vehicle of alienation is an imaginary entity, a god who gives commands, in economic alienation, in Marx's early writings, it is a complex system composed of rules and institutions which generates a distinctive set of incentives. So the capitalist system is tremendously productive, and it produces marvels and beauty, as Marx puts it. On the other hand, for the individual worker, they rarely or never experience what Marx describes as a feature of production as in human characteristic species life, namely to contemplate himself in the world he has himself created. So the pressures of competition leading to division of labor into ever smaller tasks performed by wage laborers ensure that generally a worker is going to play such a small part in the production of a product that they could not recognize their own plan or conception, that rationality, in the finished result. The idea, I think, is that it's only from the putative point of view of the economic system as a whole in capitalism that these products could be recognized as bearing their maker's mark. But in this case, it's not the mark of a human maker, but rather of a system, which is not itself a human individual, even though it depends, of course, for its existence on many actions of human individuals. Likewise, the capitalist system is, despite all tendencies towards crisis, intricate, complex, and well organized. It is a system which manages to innovate and meet a lot of demand using very little through its incentive system. Yet while from the putative point of view of the whole system, it manifests as a rational, complex whole, for individual workers, it consists often of a dull and mindless repeated operation. As Marx writes, labor, by which he means alienated labor, produces intelligence, but it produces idiocy and cretinism for the worker. So the rationality which capitalism as an economic system manifests, which is produced, is at the system level. It's not at the level generally of individual workers. That's Marx's point. There's also a sense, of course, in which the capitalist economic system, considered as a system, realizes sociality. After all, many defenses of the free enterprise system hold it to be its greatest virtue that it is able to harness selfishness to satisfy human needs. On the other hand, at the interpersonal level, capitalism's incentive system ensures that human needs are not satisfied in the truly human way Marx describes in the quote from Notes on James Mill. At the individual level, capitalists are motivated by greed, for profit, the war of the avaricious and competition, and workers must do the work for which they are able to get a wage to survive. So though the economic system as a whole satisfies needs, the individual workers do not have, in the use or enjoyment which the consumers make of their products, the immediate satisfaction and knowledge that in their labor, they have gratified a human need. So again, what we're seeing is that for all three dimensions of human flourishing, as that's understood by Feuerbach and also, I think, by Marx, these are, in a sense, realized or approximated under capitalist production, according to the early Marx, but they're realized at the level of the system, as opposed to the level of individual humans, which is, of course, the level at which human flourishing needs to be realized. So Marx's analogies between alienation in the religious sphere and alienation in the economic sphere can be fully cashed out if we accept that, on his view, the worker's human essential nature is realized or approximated vicariously at the level of a complex system composed of institutions and practices of which, of course, the workers are a part, but which is not itself a human being. All right, so that's Marx's discussion of alienated labor, and I'm applying my general schema of alienation to it. Workers, by participating in the institutions and practices of capitalist production, end up approximating or causing to be approximated at the system level the various characteristics which need to be instantiated at the individual level if humans are going to realize what Marx considers their essence. And the fact that it's realized at the system level rather than the individual level ends up causing workers and also capitalists, everybody in the system, not to be able to flourish in their own lives in the relevant way. Okay, I'm very quickly going to look at a third example from the Young Hegelians, which is Marx's text on the Jewish question, a famous essay in which he is contesting the idea that humans are fully emancipated if they are citizens of a democratic republic. While in religious alienation, the vehicle of human self-alienation, the entity onto which the realized human essence is projected, is God, in the form of political alienation, which Marx articulates here, the vehicle of self-alienation is the secular democratic state. Marx conveys this parallelism in this way. Religion is, he says, the devious acknowledgement of man through an intermediary, and he always uses this word, mittler. The state, by contrast, is the intermediary between man and man's freedom. He goes on to indicate that political alienation, no less than religious alienation, involves projecting the realized human essence onto an entity which is not itself a human individual. The perfected political state is by its nature the species life of man in opposition to his material life. On the other hand, whereas, of course, God is understood by Feuerbach and the Young Hegelians to be an imaginary, non-existent entity, the secular democratic state is real. So in democracy, it is a present and material reality as opposed to a fantasy, a dream, a postulated Christianity. And Marx's general claim is that whereas the state can liberate itself from various restrictions, including, of course, religion in the secular state, the citizens who make up that state don't necessarily liberate themselves from those restrictions themselves. So in his shorthand, a state can be a free state without man himself being a free man. And that makes very clear the idea that a form of liberation or realizing a good which needs to be realized at the individual level is instead being realized at a different level, here the level of a political institution. Okay, so there needs to be, as we know, some conception of the human good, some vehicle of vicarious flourishing, and then deleterious consequences for alienation to be realized. In this case, the vehicle is, as we've seen, the secular state, a social institution constituted by individual society members' actions, but not itself a human person. Marx claims that a form of community is realized in the state. The state has emancipated itself, but this form of community coexists with, in fact, depends on humans existing as members of civil society, in other words, in their economic life, in a way in which they're separated from each other and they're dictated to by their private interests and private desires. And that's what he goes on to consider in his work on alienated labor. Marx, of course, makes clear why he thinks that this form of alienation onto the state of a conception of the human good leads to individuals not being able to flourish themselves, because he thinks that the catalogue of rights which secular democratic states bestow on their citizens include not only rights of political participation, but also the rights protecting private property and private enterprise, which leads to humans failing to flourish in their economic activity. Okay, I've gone through that quite quickly, but I hope you can see how Marx on political alienation in his early writings exemplifies the same schema of vicarious flourishing with bad consequences for individual flourishing. To sum up on Marx, I've argued that we can best understand Marx on political and economic alienation by following up the lead which he himself gives us when he constantly compares his claims about alienation in the political and economic spheres to alienation in the religious sphere, which he understands in just the same way as Feuerbach. There are a large number of commentaries on Marx's early writings. How does this interpretation differ? Well, some interpreters take Marx to be simply enunciating an ethical ideal and then diagnosing cases where individuals or society falls short of this. In his account of alienation, according to Marx, Bertel Ullmann, for example, invents the term unalienation, defining this as the life man leads in communism, in which they achieve full realization. And then Ullmann writes, alienation is used by Marx to refer to any state of human existence which is away from or less than unalienation. Similarly, Georg Lichtheim describes Marxian alienation as failure to attain self-realization. Now, if this interpretation were adequate, Marx could have just replaced the term alienated with bad. While I think this interpretation is not wholly wrong, because Marx does depend on a particular conception of human flourishing, what it loses sight of is the way in which, for both Feuerbach and Marx, alienation involves not just failing to realize a conception of the human good, but realizing it through a substitute in a displaced or vicarious way, which is ultimately self-defeating. In the second place, one sometimes reads construals of Marx on alienation, which highlight the aspect of projection onto a vehicle and the fact that it comes to have a deleterious effect, while remaining vague about the content of the projection. For example, G.A. Cohen, scholar of Marx, says, alienation obtains when something issues forth from men, which they do not recognize as their own and which consequently dominates them. Likewise, Sean Sayers says, alienation refers to a situation in which our own activities and products take on an independent existence and become hostile powers working against us. These interpretations, I think, are not to be faulted as far as they go, but in order to home in on what is specific about the young Hegelians' use of the idea of alienation, you've got to be more specific about the content of what is projected or displaced. And I've argued that this is a form of flourishing proper to individual humans, which is displaced onto something other than individual humans. In the third place, there are recent accounts of alienation which don't aim primarily to retrieve the young Hegelian understanding of it. So alienation, but not in the young Hegelian sense. A prominent recent example is Rachel Yegi's book, Alienation. Now, I think that's absolutely fine. You know, accounts of alienation can legitimately draw on colloquial usage of the term, or also other philosophical currents, such as Heidegger, Kierkegaard, which may stress a subjective feeling of not being at home or not identifying with institutions. And as a matter of fact, such accounts may find some passages in Marx on alienated labor which resonate with them. However, in order to do full justice to the young Hegelians' conception of alienation, it is necessary to follow up this analogy, which I've highlighted, which Marx is drawing between economic and political alienation and the religious alienation described by Ludwig Feuerbach. Okay, so I've argued that alienation occurs when individuals' actions, whether creating a fantastic being or participating in an institution or whatever it might be, leads to a conception of the human good, whether a true one or just a putative one, being projected onto or realized in some non-human entity, though it may be composed of human beings, with the consequence that the individuals themselves are unable to flourish or realize the good, the relevant type of human good themselves. Now, there's nothing about the structure of the putative phenomenon of alienation, as I describe it here, which should suggest that it can occur only on the assumption that human nature takes the form of rationality, sociality, and productivity, as Feuerbach and Marx thought. Why shouldn't it be possible to diagnose alienation or vicarious flourishing using, for example, Martha Nussbaum's list of 10 central human functionings, rather than the content of essential human nature as conceived of by Marx and Feuerbach? I think by isolating this schema of alienation, which applies to all of the prominent young Hegelian case studies, one can see that the particular content of the human good, which they feed into it, down at the bottom there, the circle, the conception of the human good, it can be switched. We can switch it around, and we've still got a recognizable, instance of alienation. But how about what I started with, this idea of pluralism, about substantive conceptions of the human good? Well, I think that one of the strengths of using the concept of alienation for social criticism is that it is in fact compatible with pluralism. In other words, one way in which to conduct an immanent or internal critique of the way that somebody is living their lives, or the way a community is living their lives, is to try to provide evidence that what they're doing is realizing at a displaced level, or vicariously projecting onto something else, a conception of the good which really they need to be realizing in their own individual lives. And that need not involve projecting onto them or imposing onto them one's own conception of the human good, as long as one can provide some sort of evidence that they are actually displacing a conception of the good which really they want to be realizing in their own individual lives onto something else. So the most effective alienation critique as internal critique would persuade somebody of the following: that on the basis of facts which they themselves are willing to accept, the best explanation for them believing and behaving as they do is not that these are correct beliefs and modes of behavior to have, but that they're displaced and ultimately self-defeating modes of expression of a different conception of the good. Feuerbach goes furthest, I think, towards achieving this goal with his detailed analyses in The Essence of Christianity of Christian liturgy, and attempts to find contradictions in Christian doctrine as an aid to persuading Christians that his alternative reading of their belief system is a better explanation for their holding it than its truth. However, in the last analysis, Feuerbach and Marx fall back too often on their own conception of essential human nature for their own case studies of alienation to succeed as internal criticism. I think that a successful alienation diagnosis in a given case probably has to rely on empirical facts, historical, psychological, or other facts. It can't be a purely philosophical enterprise. So though philosophy can articulate the concept of alienation, which is what I've tried to do here, and it can point to how it could figure in an internal or an immanent form of critique, one which is neutral among conceptions of the good, it's going to require empirical support to apply this concept in particular cases. So what kind of cases might we imagine? I'm not going to provide worked out case studies, partly because I don't have the time, but here are a couple of ideas. So this conception of alienation, what scenarios could it apply to? Well, for example, cases that there needs to be, of course, a candidate vehicle for vicarious flourishing. So, cases where the suspicion arises that somebody is permitting something else to flourish in place of them. Nations, for example, or even purported races or various institutions could be obvious candidates for the suspicion that a form of human flourishing which needs to be realized at the individual level is being realized instead at the level of a collective, even if it's a collective which individuals participate in creating. But another area, I think, is technology. Technology, artificial intelligence, computer programs are quickly supplying humans with various avatars and virtual activities, which it would be quite coherent to suspect are sometimes flourishing in place of human beings themselves. So though Feuerbach is standardly passed over in discussions of alienation as just a precursor to Marx, and people want to get onto Marx's critique of economic alienation, it may be that Feuerbach's work on the forms of vicarious flourishing in the virtual world of, in his case, supernaturalism and religion, are quickly becoming much more relevant than Marx's in the contemporary world to enable us to critique forms of vicarious flourishing which exist in the real world today. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Dr. Hull. I think we're all thanking you now for a wonderful, inspiring, and a deep lecture that will hopefully help us figure out how to nurture our human flourishing and our flourishing. Yeah, all of our flourishing. Okay, so that was amazing. I think we're now going to move into the Q&A session, and the way that we're going to do this is many of you will be so everybody's online, and I have a menu here of everybody who is in the Zoom meeting online. Anybody else who isn't here in the Zoom meeting, I don't think I can see whether they have a question or not. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I will see your hand. Keep it raised. I think there's an order that is in the list as well, but I'll take note of a certain order. And yeah, keep your hand raised. If you have a question, if you have a follow-up question, I'll make room for quick follow-up questions to anybody's main hand questions. I think there's an option to raise your thumb. Raise your thumb. Raise your thumb if you do, and if I see it, I'll call on you to ask your follow-up question or make your follow-up comment. But we're going to take hands and then fingers, which are the thumb, and wait till I call on you. And if you can, and if your internet connection allows for it, could you please turn on your video so George can also see the speaker and others can see you. If you can't, that's okay, but it would be preferable to turn on your video very quickly during your question. Okay, so the first question and the first hand that I saw goes to our Vice Dean Liu.
Hi, George. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very wonderful talk. I'm just quite interested in the, I see in most of part of your lecture, you try to show a kind of general scheme, which works both for Feuerbach and also for Karl Marx with respect to the notion of alienation. I'm just wondering whether we could find the same kind of general scheme in Hegel, because you don't talk very much about Hegel, but you at the very outside, you decide there's a kind of post-Hegelian, the transformation of Hegel's metaphysical notion of alienation. But so far as we know, the alienation, the term in Hegel actually introduced in phenomenology of spirit. So I'm just wondering first, whether that is a kind of metaphysical concept of alienation, which you acknowledge here. Second, whether we could find the same general scheme for Hegel's notion. The third, what kind of relation between if we couldn't, then what kind of relation between this Hegelian notion of alienation to the post-Hegelian notion of alienation? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for that question. Let me just let me share the screen again and just show the schema. And well, so Feuerbach is known for what he called the transformative method, which roughly speaking is standing Hegel's ideas on their head. And so I think that possibly in order to make this a schema which matches Hegel's use of notions like objectification or or alienation, you flip around the sort of the circle at the bottom and the diamond at the top, because this is a little bit rough, but more or less what Hegel is interested in is processes by which the notion or the concept or spirit objectifies itself in human institutions and human ideas. And so one might see in Hegel's schema, the ultimate sort of concept projecting, as it were, onto human society, so onto human entities, an idea which actually needs to be realized at some other level. So whereas for Feuerbach and the young Hegelians, they see various kinds of alienation as sort of steps along the way to humans realizing themselves as humans, Hegel sees something like the alienation schema as steps along the way to spirits or the concept realizing itself as something non-human. So absolutely, where Feuerbach gets something like the alienation schema from is Hegel. That's absolutely, I agree. It wouldn't quite be this. It would have to be sort of reversed, approximately flipped over on the vertical axis for it to apply to Hegel. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, may I just very quickly follow up? Because when Hegel used the term alienation, it's always, connected to a kind of epistemological project, namely a kind of skepticism in Hegel's philosophy. So here, so I'm quite interested in you just mentioned at a certain point, there's a kind of internal criticism, right? So I mean, whether that kind of understanding of alienation is related to this skepticism in the Hegelian sense or not?
Well, I'm not sure I can give a full answer to that, but I agree with the idea that Hegel proceeds through a sort of internal criticism, and that's, I suppose, one understanding of the dialectic, that the seeds of the correct or the more advanced idea are already present in a way in the previous idea, and that's certainly how he proceeds in the phenomenology of spirit. Now, whether that can be expressed completely by the alienation schema, especially when he's talking about the different, the problems with immediate perception and so on in the phenomenology of spirit, I'm not sure. But I agree that there's also, I agree with you that there's also a parallel in the sense that both Hegel and the young Hegelians are proceeding through some kind of immanent or internal critique, as opposed to, imposing a different idea and then arguing for it using purely external means.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Liuji, for your excellent question. The next person is Wu Yu. The next person who will ask questions is Wu Yu, and keep your hands raised to be in the queue for questions, because there are more and more questions coming up. Okay, Wu Yu, you're next.
Hello, could you hear me? Hello.
Yes.
Oh, okay. There's something wrong with my video, so I just ask you some questions. Thank you for your very interesting lecture, and but it is a little sophisticated for me because I barely have any background about Hegel or the young Hegelian. I just asked two basic questions about one is about Feuerbach and the other is about Marx. The first question is according to your lecture, you said in Feuerbach's religion's alienation, the consciousness of God equals the self-consciousness of man. I don't understand how does God or God's consciousness structuralized in human consciousness or human behavior or human emotions such as love. Why this is a sort of alienation, not something like an instantiation or something else. This is the first one. And the second one is about Marx. And according to Marx, the human productive life is spacious life. And the capitalist system seems deprives this human production with his satisfaction. And but I'm confused about the individual status in this system. If there any possibility that a worker has his own interests or his own creative production to against this capitalist system, does that make sense in this system? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. Let me again share screen, first of all, to show the schema of religious alienation in Feuerbach. So the question was, how can the self-consciousness of humans be equated with the consciousness of God, according to Feuerbach? And the answer is that, and I didn't go through this all in detail, so it's a very good question. Feuerbach thinks that there's a psychological process by which humans project the figure of God, the non-human entity, which is God. And this is that he thinks that humans we are aware of our own capacities. We're aware of our own nature as a species. And the problem is that for a number of complicated reasons, Feuerbach thinks that sometimes we, rather than having a proper awareness of our capacities as sort of infinite spectrums along which we can attain more rationality or more sociality or more productivity, we project those capacities as realized infinite characteristics onto a person. So we're aware of our capacity to try to be more and more rational, but we're aware of it in a distorted way. We're aware of it in a dim and distant way. And so we instead project it as an individual who is infinitely rational already. So what Feuerbach's saying is that when Christians, according to him, think about God, they're actually thinking about their own nature, but they're thinking about it in a very distorted and cloudy way, because they're mistaking the capacities of the human species, which they're aware of in themselves, for an actual individual who's separate from them. So I hope that that clears it up a little bit. It is a complicated part of Feuerbach's thought. Now, the second question was about productive life in capitalism, according to the young Marx. And I think the question was about, productive activity is human species activity for Marx. Can't this also manifest as fulfilling creative work for individual humans? Well, according to Marx, hardly at all, because he thinks that capitalism at least at the time when he was writing, works as a very rigorous and ruthless system of incentives, where either you succeed by making more and more profits if you're an owner of capital, or you succeed by simply managing to get enough food to put on the table in the evening if you're a worker. And so for all of the individuals, they're not really, well, okay, another part of it is, of course, that it involves a very, very complex division of labor. So Marx was impressed by descriptions like Adam Smith's of the pin factory, where pins can be produced at a much, much faster rate if there are 16 people who work on each pin doing very, very small operations. So Marx's point with that would be, well, none of those workers even sees the finished pin as something which they've envisaged and then put into effect as a rational sort of productive process. And then they see it being used by somebody else satisfying their need, because they've only done 1/16 of the work on each pin. So it's only, according to Marx, at the level of the system as a whole that one sees proper, rational, creative production which satisfies human needs. Now, as to whether Marx is entirely right about that, that's a different question, because, of course, the subsequent reforms to capitalism in many countries have tried to create a system whereby individuals can have some satisfaction in their work and not just the system as a whole. But that's not really the topic of my talk, though, because what I'm trying to just work out is what Marx thought in the sense of what kind of schema he's using. As to whether he's correct about particular case studies, well, I'll leave that to empirical researchers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wu Yu, for your excellent question. The next question is from Xin Yu.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Hao, thank you very much for your very excellent, interesting and inspiring discussion on the concept of alienation from Feuerbach to Karl Marx. And it seemed to me that your work is very important in bridging the tradition of Marxism and the tradition of Western political theory, especially liberalism, including the conversations built by John Rawls and Marcel Nussbaum and people like that. So I find it very inspiring. I have a question about the concept of alienation, especially when you define it as a kind of a form of vicarious way of seeking human flourishing. It seems to me that vicarious, the terms of vicarious is kind of identical to delegated or just mediated form of seeking human flourishing. I'm not sure if I understand it properly. If so, do you think alienation in this broad sense is problematic in itself, or it becomes problematic only in the historical condition of capitalism? Or in other words, is there kind of a possible form of good alienation? So that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Let me share the screen with the schema again. So vicarious doesn't mean the same as delegated. It can do in some circumstances, and I haven't found a term which is completely satisfying. I sometimes said displaced as well, or projected. And your question was, could there be some cases where alienation is actually good, or at least it's not bad? Well, the way that I've defined it, it can't be, because of this part on the right of the screen, where I say that the consequence of the projection or the displacement is that the individuals are unable to realize that conception of the good or flourish in their own lives as individuals when they displace the conception of the good onto an imaginary being, whether it's God or whether it's a kind of avatar in a computer game or whatever, or whether it's an institution, or whether it's a system like capitalism, which is constituted by lots of individuals' choices. I think that there's two parts to my answer. It's not just in capitalism that alienation is a problem. I think that Feuerbach's case study of religion, at least if he's correct on his presuppositions, shows that, because that doesn't require any economic backgrounds to go through. But the second part is, could there be good forms of alienation? Well, it's not really satisfying for me just to say, well, I've defined alienation so that there can't be. I think the reason that there probably can't be is the point that I made towards the beginning of the talk, which is that, as you say, vicarious, often that involves delegating or having a representative do something for you. Well, there are some things that we can get another person to do for us. You know, somebody can do my shopping for me if I'm lucky, or somebody can maybe take my passport into an office for me, and that's fine. But if we're talking about succeeding in living a good human life for me as an individual, I think that there's something about that which means that I can't delegate that. You know, somebody can't do that for me because that's something which I've got to do. And whether I delegate or get other people to do things or participate in institutions bigger than me is part of the life which I lead, which needs to be a good human life. So I think that one can argue this also thematically. It's not just a matter of definition, and it's not just a contingency of the case studies. Living a good human life, it seems to me, is not the kind of thing that somebody else can do for you, or somebody or something else can do for you. It's something which you have to do yourself.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Shenyu. That was a great question. I actually just, if you don't have a follow-up to that, I'd like to just do a quick follow-up to that question. Okay, so George, you say that the difference between difference between delegation and alienation here is that there's some activities that the human being needs to do themselves. So in the very delegation of that activity, one perhaps is alienated because that's the type of thing that one needs to do. So that was your answer to Shenyu. But I'm wondering, how can one understand that? So the focus on, for instance, labor in that manner. So does Marx then? So okay, so the question is, what would unalienated labor be in that sense? Is labor something that is essentially something that human beings need to do? What would labor look like if it's unalienated then as an essential activity that whose parts can't be delegated? And that includes not just the activity, but for Marx in EPM, he also talks about one's alienation. One of the big emphases is on the products. So you're alienated from your products. And the way that manifests itself in EPM is that somebody takes your product and then does what they will and reaps the profits and things like that. Yeah, so I have other questions, but this sprung to mind in your answer to Shenyu. So I'll just summarize it again, this follow-up. If what makes alienated activities different from delegated activities is that the activities and the things that you're alienated from, whatever they are ones that are essential to human flourishing, then what does this say about labor itself, according to Marx, according to your story? Yeah. Okay. Could you say more about that? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Let me try to say a little bit more about those things. So this is so that's the general schema. Let's go back to Marx. Oh no, that's political. Okay, that's economic alienation. Yeah, so I don't want to say that well, I don't want to equate alienation with delegation. I wanted to say that delegation is one form of how something could be realized vicariously in the way that I'm using that term. But what would unalienated labor be? Well, according to Marx, it would be labor where at the individual level, it's labor which instantiates these three aspects of the human good: productivity, making something, recognizing some product in the world as yours, rationality, that being the outcome of a plan which instantiates one's rationality, and then also, of course, the social aspect, which he describes vividly in the notes on James Mill, where you then also recognize how what you've made is satisfying a human need. And so Marx's answer, I think, is quite clear to that. It's that at the individual level, rather than at the system level, labor would need to be instantiating those three characteristics to a high degree. But you also mentioned the four varieties of alienation which Marx goes through in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, which usually feature prominently in any interpretation. And as I recall, those are alienation from one's labor, alienation from the product, alienation from other humans, and alienation from the species essence. Now, I think that, so let me just say a couple of things about that. I think that that is a place where Marx's text can sometimes lead us astray, because as an interpreter, you zero in on those four forms of alienation and you say, okay, that's what Marx means by alienation. But in fact, you've got to look at what he's trying to do with the passage on estranged or alienated labor in that text. He's actually trying to give an alternative account of various phenomena which the political economists that he's reading, people like Smith, Ricardo, and others, in his view, just take as axiomatic. Marx is trying to say that actually these are derivative, and that they're all derivative from one phenomenon. So the way he puts it is that he's giving a derivation or a deduction in a way which is not entirely clear of, for example, private property and other things, which are taken as just axiomatic by Adam Smith. So what he actually says is that all of the other types of that alienated labor is at the origin of all of those phenomena, including private property, and also that alienated labor is at the origin or is the basis of the other so-called forms of alienation, which he discusses there: alienation from the products, from other humans, and so on. So I think that Marx doesn't think that there are distinct forms of alienation. Rather, what he thinks is that there is alienation of human productive labor under capitalism, and that this leads to the existence of private property and certain social relations between human beings and so forth. So that's why my interpretation of Marx on economic alienation made no reference at all to those different forms of alienation. I don't think that that's really his key point there. That only becomes important if you're asking the question, how does Marx think that private property is derived from alienated labor? So that's the explanation for that.
Okay, great. I don't see any hands, but stick up your hand or your finger if you want to ask a question. So I will be able to see your hand and then I will call on you. But in the meantime, I'm going to follow up to this. So your answer to that second question, or like one of the parts of this question, leads me to follow up in part to something that I took to be one of Wu Yu's questions, and that is so something you emphasized in your answer to my follow-up to Xin Yu's question was that what is key to your understanding of alienation in Marx is kind of how the individual is alienated. So the individual's human flourishing is then projected and then blocked via this projection. Okay, so my follow-up question, which I'm projecting partly into Wuyu's question a little bit, is what would you say to an alternative interpretation of alienation that I think quite a few people have, that you didn't address at the end in your discussion of alternative interpretations, and that's something like the role of class consciousness in Marx and in these discussions, that the class itself might be alienated. So it's the workers, not as individuals, but as a class that are then alienated. Some people might take that to be the heart of the alienation, and that one of the things that needs to be overcome is the alienation of workers systematically as a class. I don't see any room in your picture and the way that you're interpreting this for the role of sort of alienation story in class consciousness. In fact, it looks like if a worker thinks about the class consciousness, this would in fact just fit within your story of alienation. That if the worker thinks about the role of the worker as a worker and as a class conscious being, would think of this group of workers to which they should there are certain actions that they need to perform to make a better life with, for instance, so for instance, helping each other to be better workers, that this process, so the idea of a worker then might be something that is alienating. And I have an answer to that myself, but I like to because I like your individuals. I like the story. It's a powerful story, but I'd like to see what your answer is so the question is, what is the role of class consciousness then in this story of alienation? And in fact, does becoming class conscious, that process of class consciousness might be something that's alienating according to your story of alienation? Yes.
Thank you, Arthur. Yeah, those are very good questions. First of all, could the alienation in capitalism, according to Marx's early work, be in fact alienation of a class as opposed to alienation of individuals? I think that the answer must be no, because Marx thinks, and he's very explicit, that the individual workers and also individual owners and capitalists are equally alienated in capitalism. That's how he describes it in the economic and political manuscripts. And so I tried to describe that in how I went through Marx's story, with the idea that capitalism as a system, it has these incentives which apply differently to the workers who are trying to make a subsistence wage and to capitalists who are driven to make more and more profit. So it's a different sort of incentive, but it's incentives in both cases, and in both cases, the human productive activity is engaged in as a means to get that incentive rather than as an end in itself. So I think that since he's describing the same basic form of alienation for both capitalists and workers, it can't be as a class that people are alienated. And also, the way that he describes the unsatisfactoriness of work under capitalism is very much at the level of individual workers, that they don't sense, their product being a realization of their own plan as an individual, that they don't see other people needs being satisfied by what they've produced. So that's as regards his early work on alienation. I do think it's at the individual level. But your other question was, what about class consciousness? I mean, doesn't that play a central role in Marx's work? And of course, you're absolutely right that it does. and class struggle is later how Marx comes to envisage human history as proceeding. Well, look, I think you're raising a very interesting issue, which is, could there be certain understandings of class consciousness which themselves exhibit alienation? I think the answer is yes. If individuals were to participate in economic class activities and envisage their economic class in a way which realized some conception of the good at the level of the class, but prevented them as individuals from realizing that conception of the good, that would apply to the schema of alienation. So I think that's a very interesting suggestion. And I suppose one question would be whether some accounts of Marxist class consciousness, of which there are many, especially in the early 20th century, actually instantiate alienation in the way that the early Marx conceived of it. I think the answer might be yes, but that would need to be looked into. So that's a very interesting avenue to explore. Does class consciousness necessarily need to involve alienation? I think there the answer is perhaps no, because after all, even if we're just going with the conception of the human good which the early Marx and the early Feuerbach have, part of that is sociality, our relations with other people, perhaps in engaging in joint projects with them. So the idea that because we're realizing a human good at the individual level, that solidarity is ruled out, that wouldn't be in accord with what Feuerbach and Marx are thinking. They think that sociality is part of the human good which we need to aspire towards. So, very, very interesting suggestion, Arthur. I'd like to follow that up further, whether class consciousness on some readings actually instantiates alienation, but I don't think that all forms of class consciousness would need to do so.
Okay, great. I have plenty of follow-ups to that, but Lyoja has a hand. Please, Lyoja. Yeah.
Yeah, I find this question very interesting, as this exchange between you and George. I think let's just come back to individual, to this aspect, because we can think about this issue from the perspective of psychoanalysis. I'm just wondering whether because when Marx and also Feuerbach talk about alienation, it's a particular using this term for a kind of critique. And that presupposes that we could return to our reality, individual reality. But the problem is, from the perspective of psychoanalysis, there's always a kind of something which is hidden from us, right? So it's so dangerous to uncover the entire reality of the individual. So I'm just wondering whether alienation is something we really need to critique, or that is something we should think positively, right? That's something very helpful, very safe for human beings.
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting suggestion, actually. Now, well, let me put up the schema again. So perhaps this comes back to perhaps this is related to the question about whether all forms of vicarious realization of a conception of the good, whether they're all harmful. Because the ones which Feuerbach and Marx are interested in, and the schema as I'm presenting it here, or perhaps let me move on to the general one later. They all involve vicarious flourishing in a way which has the consequence that the individual is actually unable to realize that conception of the good. But I think what you're suggesting, Lyoja, is that perhaps in some cases, some form of projection or some form of displacement or some form of vicarious delegated activity could be necessary for flourishing, because otherwise humans could find that they're confronted with things which they're unable to bear or they're unable to deal with. And so in that case, I suppose that would be a form of projection or something like that, which is far from having the consequence that humans are not able to realize the good. It's necessary for them to realize the good.
Yeah.
And so then it certainly wouldn't correspond to this schema, and so it wouldn't correspond to what Marx and Feuerbach are talking about, because of the fact that it's actually necessary for human flourishing, as opposed to being something which hinders human flourishing. So I suppose, yeah. So okay. So 2 points really. I suppose, the alienation, as I've recovered it from the young Hegelians, it is that category of displacement of the human good which actually hinders us realizing the human good ourselves. Second answer, what exactly is it which might need to be displaced or projected for us to realize the human good? Well, maybe, I suppose perhaps the idea would be that in some areas of our life, we could, relieve ourselves from the responsibility of having to deal with everything that's going on, and try and outsource that to a kind of avatar, whether it's a virtual reality one or various groups that we're part of, or perhaps something like the success of a sport team. We could spend our Saturday afternoon supporting a sports team, and that would be fine, because it's actually necessary for us to realize the human good in our own lives. When it becomes a problem is when the whole of one's conception of the good is outsourced, so that instead of one realizing it oneself, it's entirely projected or displaced onto something else, whether that be a virtual reality avatar, or a supernatural entity, or an institution, or a system of which one's a part. So I think that your suggestion there, and the kind of ideas from psychoanalysis that some kind of projection and displacement is necessary, that helps us with drawing the borderline between forms of projection and displacement which are compatible with, maybe even necessary for human flourishing, and forms which actually make that impossible.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know whether Arthur is actually, oh yeah, let me admit Arthur to the room. Welcome back, Arthur. I think that you lost your connection for a while.
Sorry, my battery ran out for a sec. Okay, that's great. Thank you again for that question. I have to see whether there are other questions. Okay, there's no other questions. I have a I think a follow-up question that I have to ask as well, and this is a follow-up to the previous questions. Okay, so in your discussion, and this is a follow-up to the discussion about class consciousness, especially. But I'm going to combine it with another question that I had, which is, so in your discussion of the alternatives, you mentioned Bertel Ollmann's view, and you represented it as one where, he in very classic form, he likes to put things in a way that are understandable and engaging for people. So yeah, he talks about unalienated forms of life. But it looked to me like you were, so okay. So what he says there from the quote that you took and does fit in your scheme, which is that it fits in the part of the result and the bad consequences part. Okay, so it's that you are then alienated from a flourishing life. So so you're criticizing Ullmann as somebody who just kind of understands alienation as just not human flourishing and equating it with that. But I think, I mean, I know this is work in progress, but I think you could look at Ullmann in a much richer and deeper way. He has a whole way of understanding so Marx's system and including alienation in terms of sort of internal relations and conflicts, and alienation seems to be just one of the central forms where contradictions and conflict come about. I know you addressed the idea about contradictions at the beginning, where an individual might have contradicting beliefs or something like that. I think what Ullman generally emphasizes is the contradictions. No, he emphasizes the emphasis in Marx of the contradictions within society, the many contradictions within society. And I don't think you can understand, for instance, Ullman's view about alienation without putting that part of the story. So it's not just that he equates alienation with like a bad result of non-flourishing, but he does have a picture of what alienation is as something that comes out of the contradictory forces within the society. So in particular in capitalism, it's so the workers alienated in the various ways via their relationship with the capitalist, the relationship with their needs to eat and things like that. So their motivations for working, and then I think quite a lot of it is consistent with your schema. So I think your schema is very helpful, but the first thing I would say is that I don't think that it's completely fair to say that Ullman just equates it with the bad result. I think quite a lot of what he said in various places is just quite consistent with that story, and might even enrich the story with the story of contradictions. And secondly, so just to tie it back to the story about class consciousness, so something that Ullman emphasizes quite a lot is that, so he does emphasize the notion of class consciousness, and he's tied it to the notion of alienation. And in part, the answer to the question I posed to you, according to Ullman, would be something like, well, it's via the workers being class conscious that's part of the story and part of the way that they can overcome the alienation. So the workers are alienated within the capitalist system, and also within other systems. I'm sure if there are other systems that include the workers, where there are contradictions between the workers' interests and their life and their needs and the interests of others. But it's in particular when the workers become conscious that we can overcome that alienation. And I think your answer, the story about the capitalist also being alienated, that's on point. That's a really good on point thing to mention. But in fact, so class consciousness applies not just to workers. So the capitalists can be class conscious by realizing that their role in the society is as capitalist, and then understanding the interests of their class. But when they're furthering the interests of the capitalist class, what it does is undermine their general humanity as well. So the capitalist class consciousness is alienated, while the workers' class consciousness is, there might be certain forms of worker class consciousness. We have to explore what, in fact, all the details are of workers' class consciousness. But for instance, Ullman's story is that the workers' class consciousness is part of the road and almost an essential feature for everyone's overcoming alienation. So the first part of my story, my question is, it seems like you're partly unfair to Ullman. Maybe that's because this is a draft and a work in progress, but I think it's important to emphasize that Ullman doesn't just think of alienation as the result. And secondly, the answer with the class consciousness story is that workers' class consciousness is the road to unalienated labor, according to Ullman, and if Ullman is right, according to Marx. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Lots of rich things to think about there. Well, look, I think, so to really come to grips with Bertel Ollmann's theory, absolutely, I agree. One would have to place it in the perspective of his broader, considerations about Marx interpreting the way that a capitalist society works, and also the dynamics by which societies change. So you would get from a capitalist society to somewhere else. No, I agree. Okay, let me maybe, I think that the difference is there's a difference of approach here, because I think you're absolutely right that Ollmann, when he's looking at alienation, he is looking at what can alienation be based on this whole picture of what's, and really he's talking about the mature Marx thinks, when you bear in mind his other writings, Capital and so forth. And I think that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that kind of interpretative project. However, my feeling is that there is, in the early 1840s, a concept of alienation which Marx uses, which is very, very continuous with what Feuerbach was writing about in The Essence of Christianity, and is not necessarily very continuous with what Marx writes about later. So I think that that's going to be a difference between me and Bertel Ollmann, because I think that the kind of critique that Marx is engaged in the early 1840s, when he's a very young man, is actually quite different from what he's up to in Capital. So that doesn't mean that it's wrong to try to find a place for the concepts of alienation in the mature Marx, and so Bertel Ollmann does that in a very interesting way. I, on the other hand, think that there is more continuity between the early Marx and Feuerbach than between the early Marx and the later Marx. So I think that's an important difference. Now, so that's a very good point that you're making, that, not just on Ollmann's interpretation, but on a very feasible interpretation of the mature Marx, the way in which, so because something which I didn't address at all is, if there's a problem with labor in capitalism, how does one address that? How does one change that? But that's really because I don't think that, well, firstly, I don't think that that's addressed to a great extent in the economic political manuscripts, whereas of course it is by Marx's later writings. Okay, so how does one make changes to a society? A very, very important question. One which I don't think is the main focus in the economic and political manuscripts, but in any case, it's not the main focus of what I wanted to zero in on, which is, what's the form of critique? So what exactly is the problem which is being pointed to? So I think basically what you're saying is compatible with what I'm saying as regards class consciousness as a means to effect necessary changes to a society. It could very well be that a form of solidaristic consciousness is necessary to change the way in which production takes place. That's compatible with the problem with that particular type of production being that it alienates, it kind of leads to the vicarious or the displaced realization of a conception of the good which needs to be realized at the individual level. Okay, so I think we're on the same page there. Now, you mentioned at the end of your series of questions or comments the idea that there's something distinctive about the class consciousness of the proletariat, which is kind of truer or is more productive or right than that of other classes. And that's something which is taken up by other theorists, including especially Georg Lukács in his when he talks about the consciousness of the proletariat. Now, I don't think that I do think that ideas about that are present in Marx, especially a bit later. I don't think that in the economic and political manuscripts he is saying the things which would lead us to think that. And I do think that the conception of the good which he's saying is displaced to the system level is one which should be realized at the individual level. But I think that a lot of these things, it does come down to this interpretative question: how continuous is the early Marx with the later Marx? And Bertel Ollmann, I do agree, he's trying to come up with a interpretation of these early concepts like alienation, which fits in very neatly with things which Marx later has to say about class struggle, class consciousness, and the dynamics of social change. I guess, by emphasizing the continuity with Feuerbach, I'm adhering to a different interpretative camp, which says actually there's more of a break or a split between the early Marx and the late Marx. So I think that's the context in which those sorts of disagreements need to be addressed.
Yes. But isn't in the EPM the discussion about sort of the abolition of private property, for instance? I mean, that's just one of the things, but that's like one of, so he thinks, so especially in the emphasis on the alienation of the species consciousness, and then so this is the four things that you mentioned. Classically, people identify these four things. But part of the solution, according to Marx, and he does provide one, is, well, the heart of the alienation, the cause of the alienation, so not the heart of the structure of alienation, but the cause is in capitalism is this notion of private property, which especially also alienates both the worker and the capitalist. Is it? I mean, that seems to be clearly a part where you can connect it with the later work as well. Is that? Do you think that there's a very big? I mean, I can understand that what you're emphasizing is the connection with Feuerbach, and then what that reveals is something like the structure of alienation that we can get from, that we can understand outside of the context as well of critiquing capitalism. So this can be just a general form of social critique, which in the most pronounced form, according to Marx, is in how we should critique capitalism. So in the current state of affairs, maybe according to Marx, you would focus on the alienation in capitalism. And I think, yeah, so what you're doing is very, very interesting in that you're abstracting the structure of alienation. I'm not sure. I had two things going on at the same time. So George, are you still there? Okay, it's not down to me. I think the speaker has fallen out. Yes, I think let's just wait for the speaker to come back, and then I'm sure he wants to be back. Oh, just to say, I don't think I'm the host at the moment, and if the speaker would like to come back, they will have to be admitted into the group. So whoever does have the capacity to admit people, please look out for George to.
Hi, Arthur. I think you are the single person who can admit him to
Okay.
enter the Zoom meeting.
Great. Okay. I'll just wait. I'll message him to see in another way to see what the situation is. Mhm. Yes, I haven't received a notification yet that he's trying to enter the room.
Is there any internet restriction in South Africa?
I'm not sure. I don't think there are any. I'm pretty sure there aren't any, especially with Zoom. I think they are unrestricted at the moment. And he's at the university, so.
Oh, he's back.
Hi.
Oh, he's back. Excellent.
Hi, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. My internet did cut out. Sorry, Arthur.
Yes, no worries. Yeah, I guess I think we're nearing time to wrap up. I think there might, if there's any other questions, I think we might have room for just a very, very quick one, if there is any. Otherwise we might I mean, I was asking a question in the middle, but I think we can wrap up now. I think we should thank Dr. Hall for an excellent and very inspiring talk that, as one of the people asking the question said, is combining the Marxist tradition and the neo-Hegelian and German 19th century philosophy with the current contemporary discussions in political theory and social criticism, and it's showing the extreme and important relevance to the debates, to the current debates of these great thinkers such as Marx and Feuerbach. And I think Dr. Hall has, in a very elegant manner, abstracted some very key elements of their work that are of contemporary relevance and the contemporary discussions. And it's been a pleasure and a privilege for us at Peking University to have him speak here. And I'd like to thank him again, and I hope everybody will join me in thanking Dr. Hall in giving this excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.